Mike Bowdendistel, the author and host of The Stock Out. Mike, what's the last concert you went to, my friend?
I haven't been to one real recently, no, but I am a big Radiohead fan.
Oh, there you go. Nice. Yeah. Very nice. Very nice. Very nice, my friend. So what's going on? Let's talk about what's going on here. There's a report in the Wall Street Journal about people moving, or shippers moving from rail to trucks. What's going on here? What's the story, my friend?
Yeah, I mean, we agree with the overall, thoughts of the article that, there saw a market share shift in the last year, particularly starting, let's say, in the last half of 2021, because of all the service issues on the railroads, not having the containers in the right places, not having enough space in the terminals, not having enough chassis, not having enough, containers, et cetera. And, I thought that was pretty clear from looking at our sonar data, and a few of the sort of bullet points I wrote down from the journal article. Larry Gross, who knows intermodal probably better than anyone, his numbers have 1% market share loss that intermodal had versus the highway on loads that travel greater than 500 miles. Company in Chicago, STC Logistics, said they can't find enough containers. AAR says that it could potentially handle about another 20 to 30,000 loads per week. So that's out of the last week, 250,000 loads. So let's call it, they can have about, at least the AAR says they have about 10% incremental capacity, which is interesting. So maybe they're sort of placing the blame on warehouse or containers or what have you, someone other than them. And then Schneider says that intermodal containers taking about 30% longer to unload than usual, and that's driving inefficiency. So, some interesting bullet points there. Some of the things that I would add, the article cited a 12% decline in intermodal volume year to date. When we look at the data we have in Sonar and break that down between domestic and international, what sort of didn't come across in that article is that domestic, I have it up about 5% year over year, year to date, and I have international down about 19% year over year. So if you combine those two things, you really don't sort of get that granularity. So a lot of that volume impairment right now is coming, specifically from the inefficiencies, at the ports, where you've actually seen a reduction in containers clearing customs because there's just been a decline in the productivity there. So that's, I think, important for shippers to understand that are moving intermodal containers in sort of purely domestic lanes, that the situation is not as dire as in those lanes that carry a lot of imported goods. So I thought that was an important point. And then article really didn't mention anything about rates, which I think that the intermodal carriers, the domestic intermodal companies, which have to cover the increases that they're paying to the railroads every year, really, I mean, they've taken their rates up quite a lot, as well as the highway carriers did. So you really haven't seen that spread widen. I mean, maybe you saw the spread widen on fuel, because intermodal has about half the fuel surcharge to the highway. But, I mean, really, intermodal exists because it's a lower cost way to move goods, long haul. But, at least on the rate side, there wasn't a lot done on rates to encourage moving more of those goods on the rail. I mean, so last year, intermodal contract rates, domestic intermodal contract rates up about, double digits, I would say, on average. And, it could be just as high, this year. I mean, the data we have on domestic intermodal contract rates up about 13% right now versus where they were, last year at this time. Now, they're probably not going to stay up that high because the comps get easier because rates rose throughout 2021. But still, I mean, I think that's a factor that wasn't mentioned was the rates.
Yeah, so Mike, it's interesting. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You're talking about the difference between the international and the domestic. You're showing that the domestic was up about 5%, and the international was down, according to what we were seeing in Sonar and the Sonar data, et cetera. And I've seen the same thing myself. Does the urgency of the shipments, does that make a difference of the urgency of the product that is coming in internationally? Because once it hits the Inland Empire, transfers or sits for a while, it is then not international boxes anymore that may go on a rail or hit the truckload. So it could be same volume of freight really coming in, just different sets of urgency and or the pricing, because we've seen prices ease a bit out of Ontario coming east. Certainly not at an all-time low, that's for sure, still very high, but off of that $4 for sure.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I would highlight just all the delays on the ocean. And so the reason why that there's international freight has gotten to be more time sensitive and having to use the highway versus the railroad, it's just there's been just so many delays, at the ports, both the port of origin and the port of discharge. We just rolled out that new data that we get from Project 44. Usually, let's say at the port of discharge in LA, it's like a 1 or 2 day delay. Now it's a 5-day delay, and then the delays on the ocean. We're showing anywhere from 13 to 15 days right now on average, whereas usually it would only be like a 1 or 2 day delay. So these imports are taking just so much longer to get to the U.S. So they're behind schedule, and then the shippers are like, well, we can't, afford it to be delayed, any further. We can make up, a day or two by just trucking it. So I think that's what's happening.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it seems like we've been talking about this for well over a year.
Oh, yeah.
The expedited, truckload being chosen over a very crowded and bottlenecked intermodal network. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's been going on for the last year, and even before the pandemic. I mean, they called into question whether intermodal is still the growth area for the railroads. I mean, historically, it has been sort of the growth area for the railroads, but really, sort of the 4 or 5 years before the pandemic, it really hadn't grown. It had been sort of flat, and it really hadn't sort of taken the share. It's sort of had been kind of settled into kind of a GDP grower.
Yeah, and as we see the changes in the volumes, they're still up over 14,000 as far as truckload volumes, the tenders I'm looking at, which puts pressure on rail as well when that goes up and down. And the rejection rate down in many into 18.99. We're below sub 19, which is still, I mean, I can't believe it's saying we're down to 18.99, right? But that frees up the ability to move truck a little bit cheaper and so that spread between the two isn't quite as high as it was before.
Yeah, and just simply, I mean, you look at the intermodal network, the densest lane, of course, LA to Chicago, the second densest lane, LA to Dallas. All this data we're seeing in sonar that shows a loosening in Southern California of truckload capacity, that's playing a big role.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Mike. It's been a pleasure as always, and we will